What's going on, everyone, and welcome back into the Brenden Schaeffer Fantasy Football channel. Back here with another mock draft. We're going to go with a PPR, a full PPR redraft mock draft today. 12-team league with a quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex, and 4 bench spots. Pretty standard league settings as we start to get into the swing of things here with mock draft season. Let's go ahead and make it from the 10 spot, the 1.10 as we draft near the turn, but not at the turn. I think, honestly, this could end up being a pretty good area of the draft to be when you actually get to your real leagues this year because there's going to be a lot of value. I think we'll take a look at it, but like player number 8 or number 9, Brees Hall, Puka Nakua, could they be about as valuable as drafting at the turn at 112 and then getting maybe the 13th best overall player at 2.1? We'll see how we feel about it. Taking a look at the way that the draft started off here, I do think I need to spread my page out a little bit further so everything can show up on the video screen. Let me know, too, if you have any suggestions for the format of these, because learning as we go. But we go Tyreek Hill, number 1. That's probably not something you'll see. The algorithm messed up here. Eventually, I think Sleeper's going to lock it in. But really, you could see McCaffrey 1. You could see Justin Jefferson 1. I don't mind Amon-Ra St. Brown with the first overall pick. But a lot of wide receivers going early is going to provide some intriguing value late. So I'm going to go ahead here, and maybe I'd prefer Brees Hall over this player, but Jahmyr Gibbs, I think I'm going to go this route. I'm getting the 4th best running back in theory instead of having to maybe reach on the 7th best wide receiver. I just think positional value is going to be flipped a little bit this year compared to what you've seen in years past. And in a full-point PPR league, I really like Jahmyr Gibbs as my RB1 because he is a pass catcher who can not only rack up receptions, but take any given reception to the house. And when I compare just positional value, I'd rather have Jahmyr Gibbs as my RB1 than say, oh, I need an A.J. Brown. I like Garrett Wilson a lot. I even like Drake London. I think he can ascend this year, but there's a lot less, I don't know, certainty, I think, with those spots compared to Gibbs and what you can expect his workload to be. And then if you're talking about the second round, I'm willing to be a little bit more risky. I'll take a guy that doesn't have as much certainty, perhaps, and I'm eyeing Marvin Harrison at the top of this ADP list here on Sleeper. The wide receiver position also has Devontae Adams, Chris Olave, Brandon Ayuk. You could go those routes. Saquon Barkley is a huge temptation here because I think he's going to be an absolute smash in Philly. Man, let's take him. At the bell, I take Saquon Barkley. Marvin Harrison goes a few picks later. I really was thinking in my head, I'm going to lock in wide receiver 1. But I like maybe the idea that I can draft these 2 running backs, 2 guys who are going to be involved in the receiving game. Love that for PPR. 2 guys who, workload. Barkley's going to get a lot of work in Philly. Gibbs is obviously splitting with David Montgomery, but in a PPR setting, I'm very, very pleased with Jahmyr Gibbs as my first pick. I don't usually go this route, and that's why at the last moment I decided to. I usually stack up wide receivers at the beginning of a draft. I do what Team 9 did here, going Puka Nakua, Devontae Adams, and Malik Neighbors. That is typically the way I like to do things. Or how about Jamar Chase, Marvin Harrison, DJ Moore? I really like to start for that team. Even the Amon-Ra Ayuk team, not as keen on Evans in the third, but still a pretty nice receiver stack, especially when you have the 3 wide receivers starting in this format as we do. That being said, I'm going to see what it looks like. The mock draft season is to do things that you're uncomfortable with and to get a feel for, okay, if this scenario plays out in a real draft, what would I really like to do with it? Jalen Waddle is probably my interest here. Michael Pittman is another guy that's pretty interesting at the top. I think I would end up looking between the 2 of them. I'm going to go Waddle here, even though it makes me a little bit uncomfortable realizing that Michael Pittman's going to be the wide receiver 1 on his team, and we don't necessarily believe that for Waddle. Tyreek Hill is taking 1-1 in this mock. But I really like Jalen Waddle if healthy. I think he can be a difference maker. Now I'm here in the 4th round and still have the same wide receivers on the board that I'd be looking at. Another prominent wide receiver, too, Devontae Smith goes off the board, so he's not going to be an option for me here. But otherwise, as we move up the draft board, make sure it looks okay. I basically have my pick of the litter in terms of wideouts. So Michael Pittman is a temptation in this spot. Cooper Kupp, again, is he a real wide receiver 1 anymore? I do think Puka Nakua is real. And as much as I historically have loved having Cooper Kupp on my teams, I'm a little bit skittish to do it in this spot. Looking here, Anthony Richardson, I wonder if he would fall to me at the back of the 5th. I don't think he would necessarily, but I'm going to go ahead and lock in Michael Pittman because I'm a believer in Anthony Richardson, and maybe if the quarterback run doesn't come, I end up with a stack. But Lamar Jackson going as quickly as he did tells me I'm probably reaching to expect Anthony Richardson to drop to me, and that's okay. Typically, I'm not looking to draft quarterback early anyway, as he does go off the board at the 5.6, just a few picks before me. So we've locked in another wide receiver that we think is going to be a volume hog in terms of that Colts offense. I'll take the video off the screen for a moment so you get a chance to look at my roster as it's constructed now. All right, round 5, we're taking a look at wide receiver. Rashee Rice is going to be a value to anybody that is willing to maybe take a risk. Now, if he plays, right? If the suspension is not such that it completely tanks his value for the first half of the season, I'm in on Rashee Rice. We just don't know. My guess, what normally happens in these legal situations is guys get a short suspension, the slap on the wrist, and the NFL doesn't do a ton as long as there's no true legal precedent for something going terribly wrong. Kyle Pitts, I mean, tight end is really interesting at this spot. He might be the last tight end I'm willing to kind of reach on and draft in the early rounds. Kenneth Walker I like but don't need. Let's take a flyer here on Rashee Rice. Kyle Pitts does not fall back to us. Rashee might have. So that's a little bit of a misclick, I think. We would have preferred, and again, this is why we do these mock drafts, but if I had it to do over again, seeing the way it played out with no wide receivers coming off the board, Team 11 and Team 12, I probably would maybe be willing to take Pitts with the hope that Rashee Rice drops me. Both Team 11 and 12 had 2 wide receivers already. Team 12 certainly needing a running back at this point in the draft. It could have, I mean, you could have definitely seen Team 11 go with at least 1 wide receiver in these 2 picks, though. So I don't know. It's a fine play. I do like Kyle Pitts, though. I think this is a year where you're going to get the combination of like name value, name recognition because of Kyle Pitts and the way that he has been perceived for fantasy, and it's just not ever been able to live up to it. That's why you find him in the back of the 5th. But he's got a quarterback now. I have no doubt that Kyle Pitts is going to see more touchdown opportunities, just a better situation in general when it comes to this season with Kirk Cousins, as long as Kirk is healthy and ready to go. We're going to pause the draft for just a moment as I was talking through things without really looking too keenly at the board. So right now we're in a spot where we're looking to fill our flex. We've got 2 running backs we feel really good about, Waddle, Pittman, and Rice. Again, Rice, a little bit of a risk, so expecting maybe 4 to 6 games that you wouldn't have him. I think if you get him back by the playoffs and you manage your team well enough, you're going to be really glad to have Rashee Rice as your wide receiver 3. Probably a guy that would have gone in the, 3rd, early 4th round, if not for the legal issues. And I'm willing to bet that I can manage my team effectively enough to overcome it. I love drafting guys, unless it's like a real injury situation that you feel could linger. I love drafting guys where they have an injury preseason. We know kind of what the timeline is, and drafting those guys at a discount because I can, use the IL spot, the IR spot. And if your league has those, which mine typically has a few, you can put that guy, stash him away, and basically have an extra player on your team during that period, which I really enjoy. Now that I'm getting a better look at the board, Rome Odunze, Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, guys that I'm pretty interested in, Xavier Worthy, like that could be the chief that ends up being relevant in Rashee Rice's absence. Hollywood Brown also could be that guy. So I'm looking at the board at wide receiver and realizing I wish I would have picked at this point a tight end or a quarterback before this spot in the draft. Because I feel like Anthony Richardson, Lamar Jackson, there's a lot more value there in rounds 4, basically round 4. You would have had to pick, and Lamar would have been the pick. A lot more value there, and then I could have traced back and said, well, how much of a drop-off is it? And this is why these exercises are important. How much of a drop-off is it in your mind to go from, Michael Pittman, a great wide receiver 1 option, potentially in that Indy offense with an ascending quarterback, but to drop down to, say, a Rome Odunze or a Jordan Addison or even a Jaden Reed, I feel like, I'd take Pittman in each of those cases, but maybe not by a ton. Not by the difference between the upside of Lamar Jackson versus maybe a Joe Burrow that I really like the player, but not for fantasy in terms of the rushing ability. Kyler Murray, I just feel like you're getting a lot better value if you do it in the opposite direction. So these are the reasons that we do these sorts of mock drafts, to get an idea for where we want to go. But fully acknowledging that Rashee Rice may not be playing week 1, I still feel like I'm a little bit lean at wideout. In the names that jump out to me, I mentioned the 3 of them. I'm kind of deliberating between Jordan Addison, Rome Odunze, Jaden Reed just a touch behind because I think there's going to be enough competition in Green Bay that I don't for sure know he's the guy. Like if Christian Watson puts it together, Jaden Reed ends up falling off the path a little bit. Tight end, I like George Kittle, but I feel like I'd rather stock up wide receivers in this spot. But then if I do, could I be making the same mistake that I just admitted to making at quarterback? But then you can look down at TJ Hawkinson and Dallas Goedert and Cole Kmet. Some of these options I think are good enough to just get you by. So I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to go ahead and lock in. Like, what do you think about J.J. McCarthy? That's the decision you have to make with the Minnesota passing offense. There's a lot of intrigue, though, with Rome Odunze. If Caleb Williams ends up panning out, I think he could have maybe even a higher upside than Edison. I don't know. It's a tough call. Those two, I could flip-flop my rankings as time goes along. But I'll go ahead and right now take Rome Odunze because I don't think I've done that in any mock drafts. So we've got Rome Odunze as our wide receiver 4, basically our flex spot until the Rashee Rice thing is resolved, though. He's likely our wide receiver 3. So it's just something to keep in mind as I go along here and take a look at the way the rest of the board unfolds. The run on quarterbacks happened again, so we're kind of the one team waiting on that position. Team 2 doesn't have one. Team 5 doesn't have one. Everybody else, though, does have their quarterback. So we're not going to have to worry about quarterback with this pick because nobody on the end should be drafting either of these guys. Jordan Love, Caleb Williams, and even if you just miss out on those two, Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, Jaden Daniels, like there's enough value at quarterback right now that unless I get, it's at Lamar Jackson tier for me. You get the rushing upside and the passing upside. Richardson is in a similar spot as Jackson in the way that I view quarterback this year. Burrow, Prescott, Murray, I like the players, but I think I can just get better value by waiting. So if I don't get into that Richardson, Lamar tier, that's kind of my plan at quarterback. Let's take a look here, though, at whether tight end is jumping out at us. Not really. Maybe it could be time to loop back on running back. I got to tell you right now, and we'll pause the draft to talk about it. 7th round is not looking like an area that I'm too fond of in terms of the options that are available to me. You know, there are some guys that I like later. I like Ladd McConkey, but I could take him in the 8th. I like Christian Watson, like JSN. You know, Keon Coleman is even interesting as a rookie flyer for your bench. And that's what we'd be doing right now if we go RB or wide receiver. We're filling out the bench. In theory, got to keep Rashee Rice's legal situation in mind. But, man, there's just nobody that truly jumps out at me at running back either. Maybe kind of some dead zone territory. Like if it's around later, I don't mind taking a flyer on Javonte Williams in a bounce back or Nick Chubb. I don't really care about Zamir White. I'm willing to be wrong about that. Austin Eckler, interesting. Jalen Warren or Najee Harris, take your pick there. Like it's a lot of timeshare guys. Jonathan Brooks, honestly, is one of the more interesting names to me in this tier just because I feel like he's going to potentially have a starting job in Carolina. Go a little further down. I like flyers on guys like Edwards, maybe a Chase Brown. Blake Corum is interesting if there's a legit foot injury for Kyron Williams, which seems like it's just a minor thing for now. But that's kind of what I'm looking at as we dive into this spot. It's just a kind of an ugly part of the draft for me, which does make you wish you had gone in on some of those other positions, QB or tight end, earlier, because that permits you sort of to be able to get max value from each of your picks. And as much as I do like Jordan Love, Caleb Williams at the top here, I'm not overly inclined to go that route. Ladd McConkey is a name that I like, though. So what we're going to do is assume that, you know, this is a bench spot that we're drafting. I think Ladd McConkey has upside to just be the guy for Justin Herbert and a target hog. And in PPR, I really like that. So I'll stash him on my bench. He'll plop into my lineup if Rashee Rice is suspended for the first 4 or 6 weeks. It's not ideal, but I think we're comfortable with it. And again, you don't end every mock draft loving the way you performed as much as you might in other mocks. But for right now, I think we've got an okay start, and we've got players that are going to perform for fantasy. It's just a matter of, like, how do we construct our bench and how do we construct our backup plan options to be able to come up with enough upside to then be able to trade from a strength rather than be kind of behind the 8 ball during the season. I always tend to fill my bench with rookies for that reason. That being said, I do want a good third running back at some point. It might be a better fit if I were drafting on the other side of the board in the early portion of the round 1, and I'd be looking at these names here in the, what round are we in? The 8th round, and I'd be saying, okay, Javonte Williams, Nick Chubb, it just feels like you're reaching anytime you take those guys. I don't know why. Austin Eckler, it's kind of like running backs who are either older or coming off of injury, or in the case of Chubb, both, that you just don't get too excited about. It's like I'd rather maybe have, didn't mean to click Eckler there, rather have Jonathan Brooks later on, honestly, if it's me. So If I'm drafting, though, on this side of the 8th round, I feel like some of those guys are going to fall to me, whereas now I might not get Jonathan Brooks in the 9th. So that's a reason to just remember, okay, you don't love the running back options that tend to be obvious to you at this side of the draft board when you're drafting from the 1.10. That I say you general, talking to myself out loud. That's just kind of the way I look at it. I don't mind Javonte Williams or Nick Chubb. I honestly think there could be great value there. Like if Javonte ends up being the guy, there's no new sleeper updates. It's still May. I got to realize it's still May. No real training camp stuff yet. Like Javonte Williams could end up being a really interesting dude if last year he just looked a little slow, a little sluggish because of the injury, and now another year removed, he's great. He's a value in the 8th for sure. We do have to realize, though, eventually we are going to have to draft a quarterback and a tight end, and it could be during those same rounds that I'm wishing I had it covered because I like a Jaden Daniels, but he is eventually going to go off the board. Names like that are, Justin Herbert is way down the list. I could stack Caleb Williams with Rome Odunze. I could stack, who was it? McConkey with Justin Herbert. I think there's just enough value. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is down here. It's crazy how passable the quarterback options are, especially in deeper leagues. I would advocate for just punting on it and knowing that you could have Jared Goff as like the 14th or 15th off the board. And in a way, I'd be stacking with Jahmyr Gibbs. I have absolutely no problem with doing that in deeper leagues in particular. But I've talked about it for long enough. As much as I'm a little skeptical of what it's going to look like and whether the opportunity is going to be there, Sean Payton as the coach in Denver, is he in on Javonte Williams or is he going to ultimately look to replace him? Like, that's a pick that I'd like to make here. I could just go really robust at wide receiver and say, look, if Rice is out for half the year, I can still end up taking some flyers on these rookies. Maybe one of the two rookies, Odunze or Ladd, hits and still kind of end up wishing that I had a little bit more in that spot. Or I could just draft another guy here that's startable. Like, to pair with Rome Odunze, Ladd McConkey, and a questionable Rashee Rice, could DeAndre Hopkins not just get me 10 targets a game in the first half of the year, and maybe as his season goes, you feel less good about it because he's aging and that's not an offense in Tennessee that you feel super strongly about? But just looking at his stats last year, 10 targets, 7, 4, 9, 12, 12 is how he ended the season. He's going to be a target hog. I don't love going in on a guy that could absolutely fall off the cliff here. And again, I'm talking more about these picks because I'm finding myself a little bit more queasy than I normally would like to be this late in a draft. I just don't like the 7th and 8th spots unless I've already filled out quarterback, tight end, and then I feel like, well, okay, obviously you got to just take your best pick at wide receiver or running back because it's a need. But yeah, I'm definitely drafting this a little bit backwards. Like I said, I don't know if Jonathan Brooks is going to be there for me. And in a real draft, I wouldn't have a lot of time to debate these things. But let me know in the comments, too. As you're watching this decision for me, 8th round, might be one of the most interesting spots in the draft. Who would you take? Who would you take knowing that there are, a lot of interesting names on the board, but that it just doesn't feel like any of them are a true value at this point? Like DeAndre Hopkins, I've got no problem plugging him into my flex week 1 if Rashee Rice is, if he's going to be suspended. And it's less questionable than Ladd McConkey, Rome Odunze. You can sort of see what those two guys are going to do and develop into. DeAndre Hopkins feels like the type of guy that I would draft here. Here's what I'm going to do so we can move this along. I'm going to draft him, and in the league, if he has a week 1 with 11 targets, I'm trading him. I'm packaging him with somebody and moving him right then and there. May end up wishing that I went on a running back on a guy like Javonte, on a guy like Nick Chubb, Eckler. Like any of those guys would be passable bench guys, but what's the upside, right? The regret, obviously, now is that Jonathan Brooks ends up going, and so he would have been my hope for the 9.10 pick. And to not be able to land him is like, all right, we've definitely drafted ourselves into a corner here a little bit. But that's why it's May 23rd, and we like being able to do some of these things and figure it out. I am a guy, though, too. If I go heavy on running back early, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, those are my running backs, right? And if one of them gets hurt, okay, I'm going to find somebody off of waivers that can fill in. In PPR especially, I always draft heavy wide receiver so that I can maximize. And when those guys have a week where they get 12 targets and 10 receptions with a touchdown, they scored 27 fantasy points instead of like a running back's good week can be an 18 or a 19 or a 20. And I just find that I will be able to trade those wide receivers, package them with a bench player to ship them off for an upgrade more easily than I can do at the running back position. I'll take 8 or 9 PPR points from a waiver running back. I don't mind that being in my lineup when push comes to shove. All right, we've got plenty of we're just going to draft Jaden Daniels here. We're going to draft for the upside. I know that I could have waited, but I was on the clock and I've been talking for long enough. Fortunately, Goddard, Ferguson, Dobbs, and A.D. Mitchell aren't anybody that I'd be looking at. I already have Michael Pittman, so I don't need Mitchell there. Let's go ahead and take my face off the screen for a minute so we can take a look at the roster as it's constructed presently. Get that off the screen. Jaden Daniels, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley. Really like the upside of all those players. Waddle, Pittman, Rice, Odunze, McConkey, Hopkins. And again, with Hopkins, it's you're looking for that big week early, and then I can trade him. That's sort of the way that I would prefer to play it. As we get in a little bit deeper here, running back, like Blake Corum is somebody that I would like to see drop to me in the next round. I'm just going to continue to, and Jalen Wright I really like for Miami, by the way. So I'm not that worried about it. I'm going to pick a running back with one of my last 3 picks, but it doesn't have to be here. Or last 4 picks, I should say. No, yeah, we already took quarterback, so we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, I just took Jaden Daniels. Why am I in Jared Goff? That's why we do these things. Be able to kind of think on the fly is going to be something that once I know my own rankings, like I am just delving in for the first few times over the last couple of weeks. Once I know my rankings, it's going to be a lot easier to sort of figure out, how I feel about various guys. Show it back on the screen here. All right, so we're about to get this thing wrapped up. We're looking at tight end, a running back on our bench, and then whatever we want to do on our bench. If it's another wide receiver, great. If it's not, so be it. Beyond about Tyler Lockett here, I'm not too enthused by wide receivers. Like Josh Downs is fine, but you're talking about rookie flyers, and you're maybe having to scroll for him beyond that. Jameson Williams is one guy that I do feel like could end up being a breakout candidate, despite the fact that, he's had basically 2 years to do it and hasn't done it yet. I gave him a pass for year 1 with the ACL. Year 2 was the gambling suspension. It's, weird set of circumstances. Hawkinson would have been a good tight end to pick there, but I continue to stock my bench up and punt on that position. I can't believe Blake Corum was taken. I'm just getting a feel for this. It's taking me some time, but I have no problem drafting the running back that I am now inevitably going to take because Jalen Wright's there. And I'm just going to take him now, too, just so I don't get weirdly sniped on something. We're just going to take him. Cole Kmet, though, is another tight end I like that goes off the board. But, even down here, Ben Sinnott, whatever, rookie tight end, Luke Musgrave, he might not even be the best tight end with Green Bay. But we've punted the position. There's retired guys on here. Darren Waller's on the list. I just don't care. I'm gonna take. Cade Otton should be completely passable. You're really talking about a tier that at tight end is irrelevant now. I would take Kmet and then Jalen Wright if I had it to do over again. But if the guy who took Zeke would have taken Jalen Wright, then I'm really upset about it. So you kind of just roll with the punches. But the way that this shakes out, I'm just going to grab Luke Musgrave here so that I can show you the final roster. Again, I just am not that worried about tight end. The last team to pick one, I can find a way, and waivers are going to be a thing. I'm just not all that terribly worried about it. Let's go ahead and move this over here so that we can take a look at our roster at the same time. I really think this draft went okay, but I was uncomfortable going through it because there were several spots where I feel like I left EV on the board. I left expected value on the board by making some positional decisions that I would probably change if I had to do over again. But to know that, sometimes your real draft goes that way, guys. That can happen in a real draft, and you're left to go, well, what am I going to do? Quit the league? No, you just have to do with what you have, and that's why this can be a valuable tool to mock. I like the way that it shakes out. Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley, I feel incredible about. Jaden Daniels, I feel great about, especially knowing that there's going to be, Matt Stafford was taken in the 12th. There's going to be guys on waivers at quarterback. I'm just not worried about it if Jaden Daniels doesn't pan out. And if he does, he's a guy that should have been drafted up here with Anthony Richardson. So I feel good about that. Wide receiver is the spot where it's I do not have a star. I don't have an elite star, but I have guys that could rise up to that, right? Like Michael Pittman could become that. Rashee Rice, when he plays, could be that. I think you're talking about a 2-round bonus because of his potential looming suspension that I get him at a discount. And I feel like because I drafted Rashee Rice, the way I went with the rest of the draft was to load up at wide receiver and believe that anybody that pops off, someone's getting hurt out there in wide receiver land. If it's one of my guys, that's okay. I've got depth because I prioritize the position in the draft. Loaded my bench up with 3 wide receivers, guys who have upside. Jameson Williams, Ladd McConkey, I think have upside. DeAndre Hopkins, again, not youthful upside, but the fact that he's done it before. And if he shows early that he hasn't lost a step, people will be back in on D-Hop and they'll want to trade for him at a lot higher value than an 8.3 draft pick. So that's kind of the way I went about this draft. Rashee Rice, that pick definitely led me to maybe go a little bit deeper on wide receiver than I otherwise would. But my benches usually look like this anyway. If it's a 4-man bench, I'm going 3 wide receivers and a running back to kind of go for that split of 3 running backs and whatever it ended up being, 6, 7 wide receivers. I don't mind it. I really don't. Let me know what you think of it. Obviously, tight end is a bit of a punt job, but that a lot of times tight end 8 is a punt job anyway too. Tight end 7 doesn't end up finishing the season with a big-time performance. So I kind of feel okay about this draft. Let me know in the comments what you think, and click the button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe to this channel for more fantasy football mock drafts the rest of the summer. Thank you guys for watching today, and we'll talk to you next time on the channel. Peace.